Good day, ladies and gents, wherever you may be around the world, and welcome to our Australian History Settler and Aboriginals stream. And this is part one of what may well turn into a couple of parts. And I do that every week. There we go, that's that done. Sorry, dudes. I was just saying to Chris, that's why I have to run this in a different screen. Okay, Chris, shall we start off with that tune? Move us on.
G'day. How you going? All right, you add in Botany Bay there, buddy, and I'll press play.
Yep. Okay.
With a ship on anchor lays to command a gang of navvies there, they told me to engage. I thought I'd jump in for a while before I sail away, for to take a trip on an immigrant ship to the shores of Botany Bay. Farewell to your bricks and mortar, farewell to your dirty lime, farewell to your gangway and your gangplanks, and to hell with your overtime. For the good ship Ragamuffin, she's lying at the quay, for to take old Pat with a shovel on his back to the shores of Botany Bay. The best years of our lives were spent working on the docks, building mighty wharves and piers from earth and ballast to rocks. Our pensions keep our jobs secure, but I won't through the day when I'll take a trip on an immigrant ship to the shores of Botany Bay. Farewell to your bricks and mortar, farewell to your dirty lime, farewell to your gangway and your gangplanks, and to hell with your overtime. For the good ship Ragamuffin, she's lying at the quay, for to take old Pat with a shovel on his back to the shores of Botany Bay. Gonna take it back to the Botany Bay shores, dig for gold and build it too. The boss came up this morning to say, well, Pat, you know, if you don't mix all that mortar quick, I'm afraid you'll have to go. Well, of course he did insult me, so I demanded all me pay, and I told him straight that I'm gonna emigrate to the shores of Botany Bay. Farewell to your bricks and mortar, farewell to your dirty lime, farewell to your gangway and your gangplanks, and to hell with your overtime. For the good ship Ragamuffin, she's lying at the quay, for to take old Pat with a shovel on his back to the shores of Botany Bay. To the shores of Botany Bay. I reach Australia, I'll go and search for gold. There's plenty there for digging up, or so I have been told. And when I've made me fortune, there'll be no more bricks to lay, and they'll take me ease doing what I please on the shores of Botany Bay. Farewell to your bricks and mortar, farewell to your dirty lime, farewell to your gangway and your gangplanks, and to hell with your overtime. For the good ship Ragamuffin, she's lying at the quay, for to take old Pat with a shovel on his back to the shores of Botany Bay, for to break his back with a shovel and a sack on the shores of Botany Bay.
All right, that's our own Chris Gard with the shores of Botany Bay, which I thought would be appropriate for us to start with. Chris, how you doing, mate?
Very well, thank you, sir. It's a nice, drizzly, cozy day here in tropical North Queensland. It's a nice day for a stay in and talk about history.
Yeah, it's like I was just saying before we came on air, it's been the coldest November in Melbourne since 1972. So much for global warming. But, yeah. So I just turn my heater off because I can't have it on because it's like one of these gas electric things, which is noisy. So there we go. Lady is short in the chat. Good morning, dear lady. All right, this is going to be mainly Chris's show, to be honest, because he's been doing a bit of a deep dive into the history of the early settlers in Australia and their relations with the Aboriginals. So mostly you're going to be listening to Chris this morning, which is no doubt good for everyone because I have far too much to say for myself sometimes. So Chris, take it away, mate.
No worries. I'm going to go through a sort of a brief brief rundown of the earlier history of the settlement. Just sort of note some more of the prominent names, and then move quickly through as we move towards stuff surrounding the massacres, the frontier massacres, a lot of the myths surrounding them, and try to set the record straight, as it were, a little bit. But most importantly, it's just so our friends from overseas can get a little bit of an insight on the sort of situation we're in now and where it started. So hopefully we all learn something. And if you wanted to,
can I, Chris? Can I make a recommendation? If anyone is not living down under, they're not in Australia or in Australia, if they want to get some general history on the stuff we're going to talk about, I would say read Robert Hughes's The Fatal Shore.
Yep,
it's a really good introduction to early Australian history, and will surprise you about a number of things, I think, for most people.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you read any historiographical work from before the 70s, basically, you'll get a much more accurate reading of what happened. But ever since, I'll talk about it in the talk, ever since a specific bloke named Peter Reid came up with the idea of stolen, or he didn't come up with the idea, but he popularized the idea of the stolen generation, we sort of went downhill from there. And then history became completely fucking blurred. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and obviously this doesn't just apply to Australian history. I mean, almost all history, I would say, as someone who loves history, if you want to know what really happened in the world, you've got to look at stuff that was written, if possible, before World War II, but certainly before 1970. Certainly
get those dusty old books out, because that's where you're going to find the truth.
Yep, exactly, 100%, Chris, 100%.
All right. Did you want to bring up the slides there, and I'll
yeah, no worries. I think it's this one. Yeah.
That's it. Hang on. Let me move back. Do you want to take down Lady Charlotte's chat there?
Sorry, mate. Yeah, I will. How do I do? I'm trying to remember now.
Just click it again, I think.
Yeah. Yep. Done. There you go.
All right. So we'll start off in the 1600s. Well, I'll move through quickly. I won't hang around this area too long, because
so
I didn't actually.
We're talking now about the kind of the time around the English Civil War. So this is about when Cromwell was chopping the head off Charles I and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, it all links together. It's all very interesting. So before we get into the Dutch, just very quickly, I'll say there is something called the theory of Portuguese discovery in Australia, which claims that early Portuguese navigators were the first Europeans to sight Australia between 1521 and 1524, which was well before the arrival of the official first European arrival, which was Dutch navigator William Jansoen in 1606 on board the Duifken. And there's precedents for earlier non-Aboriginal visits to Australia, which have been claimed for, Chinese people. So under Admiral Zheng, China, France, Spain, and even Phoenicia. But all these were pretty much without generally accepted evidence. So for the most part, we say, the first real sort of encounter was the Dutch navigator. I've
been on board the replica of that ship, Chris.
The Duifken?
I don't know if you've seen it, but she was around Australia.
I have,
about 2000 she was around Australia, and she's tiny.
Yeah, that's it.
If you think of these people were on the far side of the world, and it would have been, for those guys, it would have almost been like modern humans going to the moon or Mars. This was a tiny little wooden ship that they were sailing around on.
So apart from that, yeah, the majority of first arrivals of exploration voyages was a series of Dutch ships coming and going between 1606 and 1670. Obviously, this being at the time when the Netherlands was one of the central economic powerhouses and oversaw many of the major expeditions into New Worlds for that period. In amongst them, there was a Spanish ship under Louis Torres who sailed through the Torres Straits in 1606 as well. And in that period as well, the odd English explorer dotted here and there, such as William Dampier, who explored the west coast of Australia in 1688. But for the most part in this section of history, this was primarily a Dutch enterprise in this region anyway, doing all the charting and exploring and whatnot. Most notable of these Dutch expeditions to Australia was the first one that I already mentioned, William Jansoen, under the commission of the Dutch East India Company in 1606. Duyfken explored the northern Cape Peninsula and made first European landfall in an area known as Weipa. I've been there and it's a shithole. And another notable and culturally relevant Dutch expedition, especially to Tasmanians such as myself, was an expedition carried out by Abel Tasman on, let me see if I can get this right, the Heemskerk and the Zeehain.
We'll have to get the Dutch
ridiculous Dutch
to do the pronunciation.
Yeah. So that was in 1642, on which he nominally discovered and charted Tasmania and named it Anthony van Diemensland after Anthony van Diemen.
We've got at least one South African in the chat, and of course South Africa was founded, I think, in 1658, around that time, also by the Dutch East India Company. So they were busy in those days.
The island's name was later changed to Van Diemen's Land by the British, and eventually changed to Tasmania for various reasons related to slow popularization from map makers based in London in the early 19th century. And I believe it's related to a particular flower that was under study at the time that was called Tasmania something. I can't remember the name of it. But yeah, cool. that was sort of the launch off for that. Now, oops. The Dutch. That's
all right, mate. You've just got Terranova stuff at the moment.
The buttons on this are really small. All good. All right. So this Dutch charting enterprise slowly shifted into the hands of the British expedition boom in the 1700s. And the first one, which everyone would have heard of, was under Captain James Cook in 1770 on the HMS Endeavour. Cook charted the eastern coast and claimed it for the British Crown. And Australia was dubbed terra nullius at that time, which basically means it was declared to be unclaimed by any sovereign nation, and therefore it was rightfully up for grabs for whoever got there first to claim it, basically. Now, Cook and friends did not have many significant interactions with the native population at this point. The majority of the initial major interactions were made around when Governor Arthur Phillips explored Botany Bay a bit later on. And Arthur Phillips was the first bloke to really get things moving. 1788 led the first, well, Phillips did. He led the first fleet of 11 ships, anchoring some in Botany Bay, others continuing to Tasmania. And he happened upon one of the best finds in his expedition, which was a beautiful area that was later named Sydney Cove. Upon finding this wondrous region, he reported to Lord Sydney back home that he, quote, had the satisfaction of finding the finest harbour in the world in which 1,000 sail of the line may ride in the most perfect security.
Yeah, Sydney Harbour is fabulous harbour.
It would have been like a pristine harbour in the early days before it became modern day Sydney Harbour, which if anyone in that area knows. It's very pretty. It's pretty.
It's still pretty and worth getting in one of the famous Sydney ferries to go and have a look at.
Yes.
If you're ever in Australia, you take one of the Sydney ferries from Circular Quay. Sydney Harbour is well worth a look. Actually, it's very pretty still.
Yes, people like us are not friend in that area, though.
no, it's pretty left wing.
It's a very cucked and posed area. Very, very. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It is. I used to like getting the ferry to go to the zoo. Like Sydney's got a good zoo, and I used to get the ferry to go to it. That used to be quite good fun from Circular Quay. And the other thing is, if you're ever at Circular Quay, there's a little plaque on the wall and it's to the first New South Wales volunteers who went to try and save General Gordon in the Sudan in 1885. And they're the very, very first diggers in the world, like Australian veterans who went and fought overseas. Sorry, Chris. I didn't.
No, you're right. You're right. All good. All right. So, yes, Phillips in Sydney Cove, seeing this, loved it. Lovely. It was in this period that Aborigines were beginning to become regularly encountered, and some tribes were a little bit hostile to settling stationaries. They were particularly hostile to, well, obviously because they were encountering them more, but stockmen, convicts, colonial emissaries, and other stuff like that. But in spite of this, contrary to popular belief in this country today, at least, the British colonial credo at this point in history was markedly different from other European colonial projects, in that their approach to natives was always one of understanding, negotiation, bargaining, attempting to form treaties and all that sort of stuff. And of course, it also included bringing in whatever roaming natives living in these lands, bringing them under the legal protection of the Crown. Now, I'll bring this up because our friend Asla Vista in the Discord brought this to my attention, and I couldn't be bothered finding this earlier. I was looking for it, but I was busy researching the other stuff. And it's from King George III's instructions to Governor Arthur Phillips. And the portion of it is related to how to treat the natives when you encounter them. Anyway, the King's message to Phillips regarding natives, which is between the 14th page and 15th page of Governor Phillips' instructions, quote, "You are to endeavour by every possible means to open an intercourse with the natives and to conciliate their affections, enjoining all our subjects to live in amity and kindness with them. And if any of our subjects shall wantonly destroy them or give them unnecessary interruption in the exercise of their several occupations, it is our will and pleasure that you do cause such offenders to be brought to punishment according to the degree of the offence. You will endeavour to procure an account of the numbers inhabiting the neighbourhood of the intended settlement, and report your opinion to one of your secretaries of state in what manner our intercourse with these people may be turned to the advantage of this country." So contrast that to, say, how the Spanish or the French treated the natives of their imperial realms. It's pretty fucking different.
There was a lot less exploitation in the British Empire than there was in many others.
What did they call it? Why nations fail? It's like you got extractive institutions, and I can't remember the other one, where they build and they generate rather than just extract, which is what the Spanish and the French love to do. I mean, look at Haiti, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I would point out is that Governor Arthur Phillips, like most of the early Australian governors, was, of course, a Royal Naval officer. And you will find that most of the early governors of Australia were Royal Navy officers. And there is one hangover from all this still in Australia to this day. Whereas in the UK, you might talk about booze. In Australia, you still talk about grog, which, of course, was a mixture of rum and water, because for years in Australia, it was almost the only alcohol you could get. And that's because of the Royal Navy connection.
All right. We'll get to the massacres. The supposed massacres anyway.
Massacres in inverted commas, yeah.
Because this is basically one of the strongest sort of dictums that is in our education system now. Is they've basically taught us all that we came here and we just massacred them and oppressed them and all this other stuff.
Utter bullshit, by the way.
Yeah, utter bullshit.
As hopefully we will prove during the stream.
Yeah, I mean, to really demonstrate the true British colonial credo for protected natives at their subjects at the time. I'll read an excerpt from Keith Windshuttle's essay, "The Myths of the Frontier Massacres in Australia," Part 1. I'll just preface it by saying that prior to this excerpt I'm about to read out, he just finished talking about the Waterloo Creek Massacre, which was a falsified historiographical event where it was claimed that police personnel under the command of Major James Nunn slaughtered up to 300 Aboriginal men and women and children and dumped their bodies in a nearby lagoon, which, by the way, was found
impossible.
Which was, by the way, was found, to be completely false, but still touted as true in most history classes in schools.
Any British or colonial officer who did something like that, 300 people would have been bloody well hung, for sure.
So after discussing that myth, Keith Windshuttle goes on in this essay to talk about an actual massacre that occurred and described how the police, how a royal commission, and then how the Supreme Court dealt with it. Now, here's Keith here. Don't let his physiognomy fool you. He's not of the tribe. He just looks that way for some reason. Anyway, Keith writes, quote,
we are all sensible centrists, Chris.
Indeed. And we love the nation of Israel, simple as. All right.
Absolutely.
Keith
and
writes,
Susan, we love you too.
Yes. What happened at Waterloo Creek is important because of the contrast it provides to the events at Mile Creek in June of the same year. The latter was a genuine massacre in which 28 Aboriginal men, women, and children had been camping peacefully on a sheep station near present-day Inverell. They were battered to death by stockmen and their bodies partially burnt. The station overseer found the corpses and reported them. The 11 men responsible were tried and at first acquitted, but on the orders of Governor Gipps, they were retried. This time, the New South Wales Supreme Court found them all guilty. 7 of them were sentenced to death and hanged.
Exactly.
Ostensibly,
that doesn't sound uneven-handed, does it?
The Mile Creek case meant that British justice prevailed. The unlawful killing of an Aboriginal person was regarded as murder. This upheld the principles of law on which the colony of New South Wales had been founded. Even though colonisation did not recognise Aboriginal title to the land that they traversed as nomadic hunter-gatherers, it did regard Aborigines as fully human beings, subjects of the King of England, and entitled to the protection of his laws. These principles were emphasised in the orders given to Governor Arthur Phillip in 1788 and were reiterated at regular intervals by subsequent British Secretaries of State of the colonies. In 1838, the holder of this office, Lord Glenelg, under Governor Gipps, a long missive reminding him of his duties in applying the rule of law to all Her Majesty's subjects. Under Gipps, the Governor Gazette proclaimed any killing of an Aborigine was always to be investigated. In every case in which an Aboriginal native may meet with a violent death in consequence of a collision with a white man, an inquest or inquiry is always to be held in the same way as if the deceased had been of European origin, end quote. So
you can't really ask fairer than that, can you, in the 19th century? Certainly.
Yeah. But yeah, as stated, the Mile Creek Massacre was committed by convict and ex-convict stockmen as the one of very few examples of properly egregious acts of murderous violence against the Aborigines in that period of history goes, in a time where hostile natives were regularly interacting with convicts and ex-convict pastoralists and stockmen and whatnot.
Chris, could I just mention one thing? There is a myth in Australia that you got sent to Australia for stealing a loaf of bread because you were starving and stuff. You didn't, for the most part.
These were the worst of the worst.
Yeah, the convicts who were sent to Australia tended to be pretty bad, actually. Yeah. I mean, all right, so they weren't always violent. Like, some of them were like forgers and people who made fake coins and this kind of stuff. But they were always pretty serious criminals. You didn't get sent to Australia for stealing a loaf of bread. That is a modern Australian myth. If you were sent to Australia, it was sometimes an alternative to hanging you.
Yeah.
But the funny thing is, most of the convicts who were sent to Australia, as is made very clear in Robert Hughes's book, The Fatal Shore, it's almost the only penal system that actually worked. Because most of the convicts sent to Australia, given a second chance, took it.
Now, I don't know this. I don't know this for a fact, but it was my understanding that there was a brief period in the colonial project when there was some corruption back in England where they were prosecuting people for petty crimes, but basically staging shit and trumping up charges in order to facilitate the building project that was going on in Tasmania at the time. I don't know if that's true, but that was what I was led to understand growing up.
Lady of Shalott is correct in the chat that there were some like Irish rebels and so on who were sent to Australia in the early days. But that was a political story, obviously, because it was like, Irish rebels who were mostly kind of supporting Napoleon and this kind of story back then. The worst British officers were not actually sent to Australia, Lady of Shalott. That's not true. Originally, the people guarding the convicts were Royal Marines, who were certainly not the worst British officers by any means. But eventually you ended up with the New South Wales Corps, which was a local regiment that was known as the Rum Corps because they ran a kind of... the only way you could get alcohol was via those guys. And obviously, if you're on the far side of the world and you're just anybody, you basically want to be able to get some grog on occasion. And these guys ran a monopoly on that. And the New South Wales Rum Corps were not very good guys, but the original people who were guarding the convicts were Royal Marines, and the Royal Marines were certainly not the worst British officers by any means. Basically the Royal Navy and the Royal Marines had some of the best British officers. I mean, look at Nelson, for God's sake, or Governor Arthur Phillip, who is another excellent Royal Navy officer.
So we'll just bring it back to this, and then we'll move on. So, as I said, the type of people that were mainly interacting with natives in a sort of in a real conflict-centric way was people like these, convicts and ex-convicts that we were just talking about, who, upon release usually became like pastoralists or stockmen or stuff like that once they were given their little lot of land.
They moved up after. What happened, for anyone who doesn't understand? Like, they did a bit of government work, so they might build bridges and roads and all this sort of shit. And then the convicts were usually given to free settlers as like indentured labor for a bit. And if they did all right doing that, then they were freed and they could do what they liked in Australia. And naturally, a lot of them moved to the frontier because that's what you do, a bit like anywhere else. So yeah, absolutely.
Well, that just necessitates that because, of course, you would get your new little piece of land on the frontier edge. You wouldn't get it in already settled land. So it was just an ever expanding project by sending ex-convicts to become overseers of different areas to raise livestock and all that sort of crap.
Absolutely. And if you want to go and look, you can find on the internet, you can find photographs of like early Australian settlers sheds. Basically, where they lived on the frontier, like they weren't living in no luxury, guys. These guys were right on the frontier of civilization, and they built themselves little sheds, basically, to start with. Yeah,
but these people were of low social standing and with an obvious propensity for criminality. So, for like with Mile Creek, when we're talking about the Mile Creek massacre. This wasn't even perpetrated by anybody that was part of the colonial project or anyone of authority. It was committed by basic scumbags, and they were fucking punished as such. Like, those who unlawfully killed any Aborigine were tried according to the British legal doctrine, and the majority of these involved were sentenced to death. Many, many such cases. So I hate to do this outflanking the left from the left bullshit, but how is it that a supposedly fucking racist, genocidal, murderous, evil colonial frontier enterprise is so fucking racist that it tried, convicted, and in many cases terminated the lives of anyone who murdered anyone of the Indigenous population? The Aboriginal population of Australia was designated as subjects of the Crown, which means they were protected under the same rule of law as any other white man of that period. This example of misrepresenting historical events, I just gave is, as I said, it's one of many. I'm just using one at the moment so I don't take up too much time because there's other stuff that I want to get into. Now, just to be accurate and not get too carried away with this sort of like revisionist enthusiasm, we can talk later about like the punitive expeditions of, for instance, one carried out by George Murray in 1928. And the generalized sort of conflict that happened between tribal men and frontiersmen, or stuff like police who were searching for any Aboriginals who may have murdered innocent whites, or vice versa. Like, it was both ways. But the net result of these events were generally equal death counts on both sides. And when we're talking actual murders in the pastoral stations and the outback in general, on the frontier line, the murders were overwhelmingly committed by Indigenous men or warrior tribesmen against stockmen and station overseers and stuff like that. It was exactly the sort of conflict you would expect to see in an occupation by a colonial enterprise. I mean, like many today would say that conflict itself is, morally wrong or whatever by today's standards. But in this era that we're talking about now, the frontier area, this sort of environment and conflict was the norm in any newly settled lands where natives roam. So the rear view moralizing from leftists that we've all just come here, like we all come to know and love these ideas of leftism and how like we're evil and we fucking, we deserve all the fucking finger pointing that we're getting now. Like the real problem I'm detailing here is like what I'd call total misrepresentation of history. And it's gone on for, 4 decades, which has only gone fucking mental as we get to current day. And in almost all cases of historical misrepresentation, the problem I'm talking about is like historians and academics, like literally just making shit up, or at least, embellishing the truth to make us look far worse than we actually were as a people.
Chris, you got to imagine, like, there you are, like me and you are both dads. There you are with your little hut that you built in the middle of fucking nowhere, and you're trying to like run a cattle station or a sheep station or whatever the fuck it might be. Excuse my language, guys. Your wife and your baby and your little kid are all at home, and you're out all day because like the only way you can make a living is like you're out all day looking after your stock. And you might be ambushed at any stage by a load of black guys who've got the arse with you for whatever reason. But you also might go home and find that your wife and your kid and your baby have all been killed while you've been out looking after your stock. And that happened fairly often.
Yep.
I've driven around the outback, as I'm sure you have, Chris, and like there's little lonely graves all over the bloody place.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was no sinecure to be in the outback of Australia in the 19th century. Trust me, it wasn't. Like, there were a few guys who found gold and who made themselves enormously rich, particularly around Melbourne and what have you. But the vast majority were eking out a living, basically, on the edges of civilization.
That's right. So, don't get me wrong. Like, shit did happen, as we were just saying. Like, shit happened, and as I've sort of outlined, it was pretty much the opposite of what we're taught now. But we did also have instances of, whites killing blacks. But as I said, they were pretty much all punished severely.
If you got caught, you'd end up being hung, just the same as if an Aboriginal was caught killing a white guy.
And that's probably a good time for you to bring up that image. I'll just remove this from the stream here. Do you want to bring up that proclamation?
Yeah. Here we go.
So this is an image.
This is a very famous proclamation for Aboriginals who couldn't read.
Yeah. And this basically outlines the legal protection for everyone that lived in the country. So it's like you don't even need to explain it. You can just look at the image and you can see what it implies.
That was the point of this. Most Aboriginals obviously couldn't read English, and so this proclamation from Governor Arthur, circa about 1830, was so Aboriginals could look at this and work out what was going to go on here. And you can see, if an Aboriginal kills a white man, the Aboriginal will end up being hung. If a white man kills an Aboriginal, the white man will be hung. And that was what actually happened 99% of the time.
Yep. All right. Well, do you want to bring up the presentation again for me, please, sir? So now we've waffled on a little bit about that. I want to move on to the stolen generation, because I think this is the tipping point that sent us to where we are now in terms of the revisionism, Chris, the leftist. Sorry,
Chris, for people outside Aussie, this is like what, late 1920s to 1940s, I'd say.
Yeah,
kind of. Yeah,
yeah. Cool. It's from the beginning of the 20th century till about World War II. So yeah, roughly those years.
So up to about the late 1940s. Yeah. All right. Cool.
Yeah.
Man.
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
Now, any Australians listening to this will be painfully aware of the Australian academic narrative of the stolen generations, something that's become somewhat of a dictum and has become ubiquitous in the education system of the entire country, where the academic will literally make the case that the supposed stolen generation, which, by the way, as I said earlier, like it was first popularized by a guy named Peter Reid, that the stolen generation, the supposed forcible removals of innocent Aboriginal kids from their happy homes and their parents, with the kids to be put in camps and whipped until they learned how to dig trenches. The story of the stolen generation is taught in schools that it was not only true, but that it justifies putting our historical welfare policy for the Indigenous population on the same level as the mid-century German policy against the Jays, or on the same level as the Ottomans against the Armenians and Greeks, or of Lenin and later Stalin's policy against political opponents. Like, this is completely unjustified and inaccurate, as we've just said. Like, the vast majority of the cases
it's a total lie, basically.
Yeah, like the vast majority of cases of like forcible removals, as per recorded by the various state and government, like Commonwealth governments in the period in question, were cases of like forcibly removing children from criminally neglectful parents or guardians. And in such cases, like many of the children were removed because they were usually being like violently abused, prostituted, or sexually abused, or malnourished, or all of the above. Like, this was not particular to the Aboriginal kids either. Like, the welfare policies for Indigenous children were literally the exact same policies used for poor white children living in the same circumstances and in the same environment. Like, but now, like, that's not to say that Aboriginals weren't treated as second-class citizens. They were, like, but that's also not to say that there was no heightened tensions between the warrior tribesmen and the frontiersmen before this period. And there were, like, shit definitely went down between these two groups. But our welfare policy for the Aboriginal children, like, that was supposed to be genocide? No, fuck off. Like, the myth of the attempted genocide of the Aboriginals is completely baseless. Like, there's clear historical record of how the state and federal governments dealt with both white and Aboriginal kids equally in terms of welfare emergency. Like,
Chris,
and it's sorry, can I just get this one last point out?
Yeah, go, man. Sorry.
Just on this last point, like in the non-emergency part of our welfare policy, like the vast majority of institutionalization of Aboriginal kids for like education and assistance, these were all voluntary for the non-emergency cases, as in the guardians sent them there. So like their parents sent them there. Like they voluntarily sent their children to do it. I'm talking about the non-emergency ones. So there was zero evidence that this was some plan to breed them out. Anyway, continue.
Oh, Chris, I was just going to say, like there were British kids who were sent to Australia anywhere between the 1940s and the 1960s, who were also sent to children's homes where some of them were abused because, surprising and amazing as it might seem, some people who run children's homes are not good people, But the same thing happened. There were like British kids who were orphans and what have you, or from broken homes, who were sent to Australia and it got exactly the same stuff. Does that mean Australia was great? No, it doesn't. But what it means is Australia was the same as everywhere else in those days. That's what was done in those days. And a lot of the Australian Aboriginal kids who were in this kind of system, some of them did quite well because they were fostered on white families and this kind of stuff. And others didn't. But like if you watch crappy movies like Rabbit Proof Fence, etc., that whole film is a lie. That whole film is a total lie.
Yeah, we were all forced to watch it as kids in school. Like I think I might have been in grade 4 or grade 5, very young, and we were everyone was forced to watch it. I'm pretty sure everyone in the country was, as a kid at that time, was forced to watch it.
Mate, I remember watching it and thinking, "Oh my god, this is terrible." But then I looked at, like when I got older, I looked at the history and realized what a scumbag the real mother of those Aboriginal children was, And maybe it wasn't her fault. Maybe it was because what happened to her when she was a kid was terrible. But the idea it was to like bad white guys is absolutely bullshit, frankly.
I'm just imagining young Duke watching that movie and then getting up, walking to the bathroom and looking in the mirror and start crying. What am I? I'm so evil.
No, I never did that, man. I've always been right of center, and I've always thought that like Anglo-Celtic people were the most civilized people in the entire universe, which they are. But no, I like later on, having watched that film later on, I read some stuff and realized that basically that film is a total lie, and the mother of those girls was actually an arsehole. And there was no dad involved anywhere, as far as I can work out. But whatever.
All right. So not many people will know this, but there was at this time actually like a different approach, like by the governments. There was like for the welfare policy, there was a different approach for half-caste kids versus full-blooded kids. So to anyone listening, half-caste just literally means like, half-breed or quarter-breed. Like they usually like, quarter-breed or half-breed, but
it's a mixed race.
That's right. They call them half-castes. And the state and Commonwealth governments created a separate and protected set of regions for Aboriginal communities that only Aboriginals were allowed into, right? And in most cases, it was particular only to full-blooded Aborigines, as the half-castes were usually rejected and ostracized by the full-bloods. The governments were just responding to and accommodating the behavior and attitudes of the Aboriginals and basically taking care of the ones that were desperately in need of help, and that was it. The ones who mainly needed help, like needed emergency care, were usually half-caste or quarter-caste Aborigines, as they were not accepted by full-bloods. And it was still in these sort of exiled communities of the half-caste, if you were, where the real horrors take place. But even in full-blooded communities, as you may know, some real nasty shit happens, especially to kids. But there was nothing anyone could do about it due to the hands-off policy, unless it was a life or death emergency. I'll give another excerpt here from Keith Windshuttle in a different essay just to prove this point. Keith writes, "From the Federation to the Second World War, the policies of the Queensland, West Australian and Commonwealth governments were to preserve full-blood Aboriginal communities. By the 1920s and 30s, these governments established reserves of millions of acres and passed laws forbidding Europeans and Asians from entering Aboriginal communities, employing or removing full-blood Aborigines without permission, having sexual relations with them, or providing them with alcohol or opium. Overwhelmingly, in the north of the continent, the Aboriginal children subject to removal policies came from the minority of half-castes and those of lesser descent. They were removed for both traditional welfare reasons and to help them gain education and training for workforce."
Sorry.
In the local idiom, the latter was known as giving them a chance. The only full-blood children taken into care were those chronically ill, dangerously malnourished, or severely disabled, but this was uncommon. Less urgent cases of child abuse and neglect among full-bloods were ignored and simply regarded as Aboriginal business. And that
as they are to this very day.
To this very fucking day. And that last passage is the absolute lightning rod for this whole problem. Let me read it again. Child abuse and neglect among full bloods were ignored and simply regarded as Aboriginal business. This perfectly encapsulates the attitude and policy approach to Aboriginal welfare and their behavior in the absence of European interference or intervention.
Chris, can I just make one point? Even to this day, Aboriginals, who are less than 2% of the modern Australian population, they have very, very high rates of domestic violence. So high that they push Australian domestic violence rates much higher than they would really be.
Indeed.
And every feminist in Australia will talk about the high rates of domestic violence in Australia. But they
men need to hold men accountable.
But they'll never tell you that a large proportion of that is Aboriginals.
Yep.
Because you're not allowed to say that.
Yep. It's that leftist NPC error 404 not found it's exactly the same as the the LGBT crowd told about the attitudes that Muslims hold towards them while they're trying to form an alliance with them as a leftist cause. It's like, you realize what they want to do to you, right?
Yeah. But honestly, guys, you really have to look at this. And John Best is correct in the chat. It's the white woman's burden in some ways, but it's a joke. Is that look, domestic violence rates in Australia are not higher than anywhere else, and in fact they're lower than the vast majority of the world if you ignore Aboriginals. But the thing is, you're not allowed to. But you can't say it's Aboriginals.
Yeah, and they're not distinguished in the statistics either. It just says male on female domestic violence, and here are the numbers. It's pretty bad. It's really fucking bad.
Most Australians are the same as most people in all of the Anglo-Celtic and Western world, and most blokes don't abuse most women. Aboriginals do a lot, but you can't say that. You're not allowed to. Yeah. Susan, well, they obviously only in Minecraft, Susan. Honestly,
they bash each other up. I mean, there's loads of. I've seen it all the time up here because obviously where I am, it's 1/3 Indigenous, so I see this everywhere. But you do a lot of cases get a big Aboriginal woman with a little scrawny man, and she just terrorizes him, beats the living shit out of him. You know, it's not just one way. It's like they beat the crap out of each other. And whoever's bigger and scary will do the beating, basically. So
there was a thing, Chris. I can't remember where I read this now. It was probably in Robert Hughes's book, but like there were tribes in New South Wales, Aboriginal tribes, who, if the two tribes had been at war, and one tribe wanted to make peace, they would give the tribe they wanted to make peace one of their women, who could be beaten up and raped and anything they liked, because that way there would be peace. No, I'm not lying. This is what these dudes did.
Horrible.
Yeah, I by our standards, absolutely, but that's what they did.
Yep. So there are some harrowing stories I've heard personally from people I know very well who are very close to all this stuff, like especially with transit for the closed off communities. Stories about some of the abuse and like sexual violence that's inflicted on young children, particularly very young girls. I'm talking like 4 to 10 years old, sometimes younger. These stories will make your skin crawl. But the most infuriating part of this problem is not the violence committed by the adult male tribesmen in the communities on the little kids. It's in fact the state or federal government's involvement in basically just looking the other way. And in some cases, picking up a violently raped child on a plane, taking them to hospital, treating their injuries, and then putting them back on the plane and sending them straight back to the fucking community. Hands off, they call it. They call it central, like cultural sensitivity. They're like, like my friend told me about this directly. She was one of the stewards that was on one of these charter planes that would bus kids to and from hospital and to and from boarding school, right? And that's exactly what happened, and that happened routinely. And in one of the cases, one of the judges up here, I think it was 4 of the elders and then a bunch of their brothers, they were detained and they were taken to court for one of these instances, right? But they were all literally just set free, given a slap on the wrist and sent straight back to the community the next day.
And you mustn't interfere with this wonderful culture.
Yeah. And of course, she was saying that when they were landing, there was basically the entire tribe waiting at the runway, applauding as they come down to land because their elders are coming home, after they just raped like a little girl. It's like, this problem is unsolvable. Like, according to the popular, like, moral dictates of this regime that we live under, like, if you take these children away from the violence and the sexual abuse and you adopt them out to people who will actually take care of them, you are supposedly genociding them. But if you leave them alone, they basically just continue on their little intracommunal cycle of abuse. And the blame for all their problems and pain that comes from it is forever placed on the hands of the British colonial frontier and, by extension, us. There's plenty of evidence in the historical record that the cultural practices of many of the tribes prior to British interference that were, by British standards, even at this much harsher time in history, the cultural practices were undeniably barbaric. Like, this is not something unique to post-colonial influence and intergenerational trauma caused by whites' treatment of blacks. This was going on long before we ever arrived. But we're still blamed for it. Like, we will always be blamed for it. And now that there are literally thousands of authors and journalists and academics, like various bureaucrats and other regime creatures who, like, they actually profit on the narrative of the genocidal British colonialists, right? The regime is now incentivized.
They make their living from these lies.
They're incentivized by the grievance market to, like, not only perpetuate the myths, but to embellish them further. Like, we get taught in schools, and now in every fucking civil service or corporate job or position, we get taught that we're evil and genocidal, and that we have to bend the knee and pay lip service to the cause of reparations. I mean, just look at any corporate or government document published in the past, say 3 or 4 years. Like, look at the quotes and the prefaces that they're usually in large print at the top or at the bottom of the documents. You know, it's just these annotations sprawled across the sheet in this fucking, like, diuretic apologia, like just talking about the noble, righteous, sanctimonious demands for reconciliation and their request of white Australian servitude, respect and acknowledgement to this and that tribe in whatever area the companies are at. Like, it's fucking insufferable, and it gets worse with every iteration. Like, anyone working in these companies or government departments in Australia, they'd be intimately familiar with this fucking welcome to country introduction speech that every meeting director has to open with every single meeting. And it goes something like, I begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather, blah, 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 elders past and present, blah, blah, blah. It's just this insufferable lip service. And it doesn't even matter. It doesn't even matter if it's, like, literally in a room full of white people and it's a white person saying it at the start of every meeting and that none of them believe in the nonsense or care about it. It's still compulsory to do so. Fuck's sake. But I did want to mention one last thing.
Chris,
sorry.
Look, 100% true. And
I'm
like,
so mad.
If you are, you can only believe this shit if you're a moron. You have to be a moron to believe this shit, because it's just not the way anyone ever carried on, you know. Like, in the early days, and even in the early days of federal Australia, once it was a nation, everybody tried to be as sensitive to the Aboriginals as they could be, but it's been a disaster. It's been a disaster. It really has. Now, like, you could argue, like, maybe Australia should just be Aboriginals, and they should be able to rape their 5-year-olds anytime they like. I suppose you could argue that. If you were a cunt, excuse my language, but, you know, that's what you would have to argue.
Yep.
And I'm not talking about petrol sniffing or, like, falling asleep on roads and getting run over by fucking road train trucks. I'm talking about, you could argue that, okay, let the Aboriginals do what the Aboriginals did. Well, if you did that, you'd end up with raped 5-year-olds.
Yeah. Yep.
Basically. Would that be a good thing to the left? I don't know. Maybe it would.
Well, I mean, to be fair, it already happens, whether we let them or not.
Yeah, well, we kind of do let them. We kind of do let them because, like, in some of these Aboriginal communities, as you know, Chris, because you live at the top end, and in far north Queensland, we kind of do let them do that.
Yeah. And of course, we have this amazing and wonderful problem that basically the Aboriginals are now no longer held accountable for their actions. And of course, now that they've learned that, they behave deliberately worse. I'm talking like the ones that sort of live in neighborhoods, you know, in suburban, not the ones that are out in these closed off communities. Of course, they do that, but they don't act in brazen sort of contradiction to the law that we lay down in anyway. I'm talking the ones that live in towns and cities and stuff amongst the white population. And they like the ones that do, I mean, I'm talking about the youth criminals and all this sort of stuff. Like, they, as I said, they behave deliberately worse, and they seem to do it almost out of spite and arrogance. Like, you can actually see it in their behavior and their manner when they're obviously out looking for something to do, and they just do it, whatever the fuck they want. They know they're untouchable now, and because that fact is known to them, we're seeing record crime up here: carjackings, burglaries, assaults, muggings, vandalism. Like, these kids just they just wander into people's houses at night, and they'll, in some cases, even if you're home, they'll like home in bed asleep, they'll just walk in, lean over you, take the keys off your nightstand, walk out, and take your car. They just don't give a fuck. And this doesn't just happen in like high crime, shitty areas either. Many of them just like slowly move away from where they live up. Like, they take buses and just slowly steal cars and move their way further north or further south. And then they just take people's shit or just smash stuff up. And no one does a fucking thing about it, because the court systems essentially just slap them on the wrist and send them straight back to their community. And in the case of like any of them that are under the age of 16 or 18, I can't remember which age is the cap before they become tried as an adult. I'm pretty 16, maybe, I don't know. But in those cases of these kids, they don't even process or prosecute them for anything at all. They'll just put them on a bus and send them back to whatever their legal home address is, to start the whole process over and over again. Like, they'll just leave wherever they were, take a bus and fuck off and do the same thing again. And they film it. Oh, sorry.
Chris, there's two things I'd like to say. First of all, I have met really good Aboriginal people. Like, I've met really genuinely good Aboriginal people.
As have I.
Like Aboriginal artists. I've met Aboriginal girls. I've met like really good people who were nice and kind, and like nothing against them whatsoever. But that ain't the majority.
That's
not the majority. But there absolutely are really good Aboriginal people. There are. And people trying to do their best, like the rest of us are trying to do. But that's not the majority. But what the Australian system today is that, we don't judge Aboriginal people on the same way we judge everybody else.
Yeah. And I mean, like, the whole point of me arguing this is like, I'm not laying all of this moral judgment on Aboriginals for everything all the time, and it's all their fault. This is a catch-22 that sort of entered into a positive feedback loop, and this is the result. Like, this isn't. I'm trying to be as careful as I can to say that the only reason we're in this situation is because the court systems have basically just let them do whatever the fuck they want. And especially up here where I live, because it's so fucking rampant, they literally don't have the resources to deal with it. So they have to just sort of shift and adjust to accommodate with what they've got.
And Chris, another thing I want to make clear to people who are not in Australia is, like, if I, as a white dude, want to go into, say, Arnhem Land, for example, I'm only allowed to go there if I ask the Aboriginal dudes for a permit to be allowed to go there.
Indeed. And the Aboriginals in Arnhem Land, they don't really do any of this stuff anyway. They're much more civilized, much nicer. The really tribal Aboriginals these days, like in Arnhem Land, are actually the best Aboriginals there are. And Indeed.
You know what? They're mostly run by their women.
Yeah. Yeah. And with this crime stuff that I was talking about, the crime waves that are happening up here, this stuff's all obscured from like the wider national public, and it's done by like it's obfuscated by all the usual suspects in the cosmopolitan journalist class, the kind, like living in their gay little studio apartments in Sydney, sipping Sancerre, reading Nature magazine, and getting bummed by their cocktail party friends on the Red. You know the types. They're the ones that have the fucking gall. They have the fucking gall to tell people who live in the areas I live in that your eyes and your ears and your stolen car are all lying to you. Don't you know that the Indigenous crime sprees are actually just statistics made up by racist media to paint the Aboriginals in a negative light? Did you know that? And do you know?
It's insane. It's insane, mate. It's insane.
Yeah.
I mean, as Lady of Charlotte just said in the chat, The Aboriginals in Arnhem Land, which is basically run by Aboriginals, as I just said, like for a white dude to even go to Arnhem Land, you have to get the Aboriginal Tribal Council to give you a permit. You're not even allowed to go there unless you get that. But that is very, very, very traditional, and to some extent, but it's basically run by Aboriginal women. And like this is one of the places where there is no booze, there's no grog. You can't drink in that place because the Aboriginal women know what the Aboriginal men do when they get drunk.
But
and is that our problem as Anglo-Celtic guys? I don't know. I don't think it is really. I don't think it really is.
Yeah. Sorry, just to get back to it because it's just on my mind. There's this thing that they do with statistics, right? And this is how the journalists they justify the assertion that Aboriginal crime rates are made up. Like they do it by, it's very tricky. They do it by citing stats on the number of police interactions with Aboriginals, specifically the Indigenous youth. And of course, because we're in clown world, according to the stats, police interactions with Aboriginals are actually indeed down in key areas where these problems are. But can you guess why the police interactions are down?
Because the only police in most Aboriginal areas are Aboriginal police.
Well, not just that, but in my area, all right, I'll give an example. I think it's a combination of two things. On the one hand, it's partially because they have to reclassify a lot of these interactions with Aboriginal kids as being that of social services / welfare problem rather than a criminal one. But primarily it's because the police just aren't actually dealing with the majority of these reprobates anymore because they can't. They basically only respond to serious complaints and emergencies such as like violent domestic abuse or assault, bashing the missus, stabbings, gang bashings, the good stuff. But the rest of the minor misdemeanor stuff, like the petty crime, it's just ignored. Like the police just don't have the resources all the time to deal with the magnitude of petty crime that goes on. Absolutely. And as you would imagine, the more brazen the kids become, the higher the frequency of petty crime, and thus would expect that in order to deal with the catastrophic public image of the police commissioner and the local government, the classification of what a crime actually is constantly modified and contracted to include 100%. Less and less types of crimes in that classification, all because 100%. Of the massive uncontrollable increase of actual crime committed by this demographic. And you can thank the courts for this. I'm sure that given enough time, that carjacking, stabbing, and gang bashing will also be dropped from the police's circle of concern because the kind, caring, empathetic courts will say so. Besides, the kids, they just need hugs and kisses and to be told they're perfect, and then they'll finally act like us, right, guys?
Yeah, 100%, Chris. But I mean, also, let's be realistic. Most rural Aboriginal communities only have Aboriginal cops. Like the only cops in their area will be other Aboriginals.
But it's specifically in these like suburban, metropolitan areas.
Totally.
In the town centre where all these areas are, it's like you're dealing, and especially up here because Cairns is basically a place where they send training cops from down south. They station them up here for 6 to 12 months or whatever to see what it's like, basically, and give them good sort of training in dealing with Indigenous population. Because really, the majority of the call-outs they do are horror, like major assaults and domestic violence, and they have to go in the thick of it and see it every day. That's basically why, for the most part, you'll never get pulled over up here if you're a white man driving around. I've not been pulled over once. I've lived here for 5 years. I drive every day, probably about 50 kilometers a day. I never get pulled over once. And most of my friends have said the same thing. And all the people up here, they don't have time to deal with that stuff because they're constantly dealing with these fucking horrible domestic abuse call outs and and welfare emergencies for kids getting beaten up and stabbed, and it's fucking horrible, man. Like,
look, like Chris, the far north Queensland cops always struck me a bit like the South African cops. They were pretty good guys because like the stuff they dealt with that had to be dealt with was really serious, and everything else they didn't much care about, to be honest. Yeah, I don't disagree with you at all, but it's true. Like if you go to Arnhem Land or any Aboriginal tribal area, the only cops in those areas will be other Aboriginals. But then you've got to look, how high up are they in the Aboriginal hierarchy? Because if they're not high enough up, doesn't matter that you got a cop there, because like he's got no sway because he's not high enough in the tribal hierarchy. That's always been true too. So it's a complicated thing, but it ain't about bad white people. It's about white people just saying, "Oh, all right, well, we'll let the Abos do what they want." Really.
So like
in Minecraft, Susan.
As I said, like, I live in a place where the population is 1/3 Indigenous, right? As I've said, and I'm not a retard, and I'm not blind. And neither of the people who live here. We see it regularly, and it's always the same demographic. And anyone who says otherwise is either retarded or a liar or both. And I hate to harp on about this because it really pisses me off, but these journalists from down south, right? I gotta love, the articles they put out or the news pieces or op-eds or whatever, they get released, written by some Sydney soft cock who probably wears a turtleneck and has a loose ass, writing articles basically telling me that what I and everyone else living here is seeing is actually an illusion. That in fact, Aborigines are not disproportionately criminal because you see the stats are in, the stats are in, the stats are in. And the stats say that the number of police interactions with Aboriginals has gone down. So it's all racist propaganda that your house gets broken into twice a month and your car gets stolen every year by the same demographic. It's just an illusion. It's just racism. And as I've said many times.
Chris, another thing for people outside Australia is like if you wanted to drive from Melbourne to where you live, Chris, in Cairns, that's a 3-day or 4-day drive if you don't stop at all. Like Australia is an enormous country.
Oh yeah,
it's about the same size as the USA minus Alaska. Like it's enormous, and so if you want to drive from Melbourne to where Chris lives in Cairns, you're looking at 3 or 4 days.
Yeah,
with
easily.
Like maybe having a couple of hours a day to stop. It's enormous. So like you got to look at that too.
Yeah. And as I've said many times in the past, and I'm sure a lot of people that maybe are listening or people I know, they've all heard me say this, which is like I would urge any one of these like Cosmo journalists to spend 1 day in a closed community like Yarrabah or Arakoon, 1 day. And I guarantee you after 1 day, they'll be putting on red armbands and doing the Roman salute. Like these cunts have no idea. And I don't know if Jobo's listening or not, but this is just in regard to what he was saying, that it's not actually the leftist academics' fault that we're in the situation we're in now, but it's actually just the Aboriginals' fault. I'll just quote one last quick excerpt from one of Keith's essays, and then I'll be done. It's in regards to the introduction of the stolen generation as a narrative. And then this is really important. And this will sort of dispel the idea that it is all the Aboriginals' fault from the start. And like, we did everything we could. So here's what he said on this. And this really brings it home regarding the stolen generation. Quote, "It is not difficult to understand the immediate appeal of such an explanation to many Aboriginal families, especially to those who had grown up on welfare communities and segregated housing estates with high rates of crime, alcoholism, domestic violence, and child abuse. This new version of events, the stolen generation, was deeply comforting. The myriad problems in their own lives no longer derived from the failings of their families or the bad choices they made themselves. Mothers had not given their children away. Fathers had not left their children destitute or deserted their families or been so consumed by alcohol they left them vulnerable to sexual predators. Siblings and cousins had not abandoned their communities because they thought their way of life was hopeless. Instead of reproaching themselves, Aborigines could suddenly identify as morally innocent victims of a terrible injustice. Their problems could all be blamed on faceless white bureaucrats driven by racism. Reid's interpretation has since come to be believed by most Aboriginal children in Australia, most Aboriginal people in Australia, end quote, and also pretty much everyone else. And we now pretty much everyone believes that. So as you can see,
it's kind of forced on you at school, Chris.
Yeah. I mean, and as you'd imagine, after you've given this narrative, like that's basically a get out of jail free card, because now the courts basically adapt to you around that premise. So ticket to do whatever the fuck you want, basically. It's like, and this isn't just like, this isn't abstract academic shit. This has been encoded in law. This is the courts support this. So that's why we're in this position, because we literally can't fucking do anything about it.
Chris.
So just one last thing. Although they do actually perpetrate the crimes, right? The fact is that they can't be held accountable. So what the fuck do you expect is going to happen? It'd be the same if it was underclass white kids as well. If there was no chance of being sent to jail or anything like that, and you're a criminal, you just do it, because there's status in criminality amongst other criminals. They compete with each other.
Yeah,
they compete with each other. They do these little thing where they record they do a carjacking and then drive down the highway at 180 k's an hour. They'll film it and put it on Snapchat and send it around to their other buddies saying, "Oh, beat this," and then their buddies watch the video and go, "Fuck, we got to beat that." That's the thing. That's why the crime wave up here is so insane, because they're all literally fucking competing with each other because they know they can't get locked up.
100%, Chris. I'm not disagreeing with you at all. Oh, look, I saw someone in the chat, I can't remember who it was, talking about the British underclass recently. But I don't know, the British underclass is basically kind of the British working class.
Well, and once upon a time would have been.
Yeah, they would have been the British working class. And those guys were fucking salt of the earth. So, I don't know. The British underclass, less, I agree. But, when you get enough propaganda and enough corporate globalists turning around and saying, and they're not all Jewish, many of them are not, they're white Christian people, turning around and saying, oh, no, like, fucking British underclass are terrible. And too many dads who are not dads because they're not at home with their kids. You got to look at this stuff. And that is the same kind of thing that we're talking about here, Chris, with the Aboriginals. Are there good Aboriginal dads who are fathers with their Aboriginal kids? Yeah, absolutely there are. But they're a minority.
Yeah.
But there are some.
Yeah,
but there are some. And good on them. But, like, basically all of the good Aboriginal stuff has gone out the window. And what we have left is what the left and the corporate globalists want, which is basically, oh, no, let all the Aboriginals go wild.
Yeah.
That's what we're left with. And the history of Australia is Australian colonial governments and then Australian actual governments trying to do their best for the Aboriginals, but every single thing we ever did is now labelled as colonialism and terrible and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
Well, all right, maybe it is, but I don't know. If I was a little Aboriginal girl of 5 or 6 getting raped by my uncle, I might not think that.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a really common occurrence too with most of the girls that grow up. So
yes, it is. Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
And they embody it. You can see it on their face. Like that. There's the way they treat each other is Fuck me, man.
Look,
Oh.
again, I want to emphasize this. There are many good Aboriginal people. There are many good Aboriginal people who are good parents, and there are many good Aboriginal people who want the best for their people. But if you look at the average scumbags in the Aboriginal community, like I said, you end up with raped 5 and 6 year old girls.
Yeah.
In Minecraft, Susan, of course, because
Well, I mean, in this case, we're actually describing things that actually did happen.
Yes.
We don't want to soften it. It's pretty.
No, I
it's
don't
fucking
want to
barbaric.
soften it, but I also don't want to lose my channel. And I understand YouTube is not a free speech platform. All right.
Indeed.
But yeah, absolutely. And me, as an English Anglo-Celtic man, absolutely, I detest the idea of little girls being raped by anyone.
Mm.
And I don't care what color they are. Don't care what color they are. I don't care what race they are. It just should not happen.
Yeah. And I mean, people would call our approach paternalistic, like condescending, paternalistic sort of, control. Yeah. But it's like when you're looking at that sort of, when you're looking at that playing field, like, what are you going to do? Just sit back? I mean, there's one part of humanity that universally in the West, we always put priority on protecting, and that's kids. So by not doing that, we are basically just completely destroying our own worth, like as moral Westerners. So I don't know. I mean, is it paternalistic to save a kid from getting raped?
We are destroying our own kids at the moment with our trans story hours and little 5-year-olds whose mothers are allowed to make them be transgender at 5. Like, when my son was 5, he wanted to be a train driver. Didn't mean he really wanted to be a train driver, you know what I mean? So you've got this shit going on. You can watch videos on YouTube, which is not a free speech platform, where a 7 or 8 year old kid is a 7 or 8 year old boy is dancing in a gay strip club and having gay people putting dollar bills in his pants.
Yep.
That's apparently like where we are now, and Joe Biden's fully in with that, and Sunak's fully in with that, and the Aussie Prime Minister is fully in with that. But no, I mean, look, we live in a sick time, man. That no real parent. I don't. When I say no real parent, I mean, don't care if you're a white guy, Anglo-Celtic guy, American guy, or an Aboriginal. No real parent would possibly stand for that shit.
No.
But this is where we are.
Indeed.
It's disgusting. And,
homeschool your kids, people.
Oh, look, Lady of Charlotte, I know, does homeschooling. That's got to be the way to go. Because, schools are propaganda and brainwashing places for people these days. We're coming up to Christmas. Every single advert you will see on the TV will have a mixed race couple.
Oh, fuck. Oh my God. You watched that UO yesterday, just watching the side illustrations for the online safety bill. It's like, literally every illustration where there's more than one person. And if it is one person, it's like a person of color. But every time there was a drawing of more than one person, it's like the most diverse mixed race illustration you'll ever see. And then one where it's like the obese woman in a wheelchair sitting next to a person in a burqa. It's like, oh my God. Oh, amazing.
This is what our so-called elites want for us, Chris.
Yeah.
It's what they want for us. Me, I'm going to fight against it until I draw my last breath.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure if, well, I mean, we do make slight nudges in the zeitgeist if we're all doing a little bit of, pushback, like collectively. But for the most part, it is going to be the counter elites who come in and basically just change the paradigm from the top. But they have to be someone who's populist and obsessed with what people think about them, like Elon Musk, who, as people keep saying, he might not be on our side, but he is still doing the things that facilitating our voices, basically getting back into the Overton window. So, yeah, I don't know, but we should all still keep doing exactly what we're doing.
I don't know, Chris. Like, I reckon your family were Anzacs and all this stuff. Yep. My family was certainly cannon fodder. Mm-hmm. Do you know what? They would never have surrendered to this shit that we're going through today.
No.
They would not.
No. Well, they wouldn't have ever imagined anything like this could have happened. They wouldn't believe you.
No, because they were all nationalists. You know, the blokes who went across on D-Day, whether they were Brits or Canadians or Yanks, they were all nationalists.
Mm.
All of them, because that was the normal way to be back then.
Yeah.
The idea that, somehow this was the start of the gay is bollocks. It's left-wing propaganda. I mean, do you reckon the dudes on the Kokoda Trail in New Guinea who stopped the Japanese, do you reckon they were, not really pro-Australian? Because I don't, myself.
No, they were agents of the gay, Duke.
Yeah, right. Yeah. They didn't just think, nah, fuck this shit.
Yeah.
But yeah, all right. I mean, look, what can you do? You've got to say the truth, I think. Hang on, there was somebody in
that's all really all we can do is just keep saying true things that are bound to reality. Because the reality always we're in a moment in history where insanity has actually taken over as the ruling moral paradigm. Like actual
100%,
actual extremism. So all you can do is continue to say true things. So because it will reality and truth always rears its head, no matter what situation we're on. We'll always bounce back. So yeah.
555 in the chat says, Lady of Shot, History Debunked gets a bit like a magazine and starts producing the same story on a cycle. History Debunked, right? He's an old dude in the UK. And some people detest him because apparently he had lived in Israel or something. I like History Debunked. I don't see many of his videos that I think, oh, no, you're lying there, mate.
Right.
The only people I see who really hate him are like the people who think everything is small hats. And look, I absolutely believe there is a JQ thing, particularly in America, but there is a JQ thing. But on the other hand, the idea that all small hats are evil is ridiculous. It's not true. And the ones who are evil are not very religious, it has to be said. So, but that's my own view. And if you people
you're exactly right. It's been pointed out that the ones that sort of create the most problems in our society are actually the secular ones who what you would have considered. So what Julius Evola would have called it the rootless what did he call him? Rootless cosmopolitan, who has no ties to any land or people. He's forever in exile. So his behavior, I shouldn't actually really say this, is probably get you in trouble. You sort of know where I'm getting when you've got no ties to any land.
Understand.
You do tend to behave a certain way, especially if you renounce your religiosity and you just act in the cultural sense rather than the religious sense.
Absolutely. So. Totally agree, mate. All of that is true. Look, there is such a thing as the JQ, and you've only got to look at
Careful.
Yeah, Susan, in Minecraft,
Shut it down.
In Minecraft, Susan, you've only got to look at media, films, music, banking. There's a bit of an over-representation, shall we say. There just is.
Yeah,
But
and
recognizing that, sorry, mate, carry on.
No, I was just going to say, if it was the Indians doing it, it'd be exactly the same because they're highly nepotistic. You can't expect anything different to it.
Yeah.
So if you have a powerful class of political elites that are highly nepotistic, it's like this is exactly what you get. It's not a mystery. It's not like, oh my god, a conspiracy. It's like no, they're just fucking nepotistic. It's simple as, and they've been in those industries for a century.
We've also got to look at our real enemies, like that pedophile Biden, who's also like completely gaga, as everyone else knows except the left. And people like Rishi Sunak, never elected, just appointed. I don't think either of those guys are small hats. They're not. There are enormous numbers of non-small hats who are absolutely in support of their position. But then you can also look at people like there are Jewish people who are on our side, is what I was going to say, although they tend to be more religious.
Can you bring up George's chat?
I don't take this blanket position of like, Jewish people bad, everyone else great, because it's not true. You got to look what's going on.
Can you bring up George's
John
chat?
Best in the chat says Dan Snow isn't, but still a prick. Yeah, Dan Snow is an absolute CUNT, mate. I detest him. Attlee, detest him. Churchill, don't like him at all. So go wherever you want with those things. But yeah, I look. The original story of Australia was the British government and then the early colonial governments trying to do their best to protect the Aboriginals. They did. They tried, but how do you do that?
Yeah.
And today we're in this position where people on the left want the Aboriginals to have an absolute veto on everything that goes on in Australia.
Yeah.
That is what the latest Labour Party deal is about. And it's ridiculous. Because they're not even 2% of the population. I mean, it's like, Chris, you will have seen this. Every single government website you go on, whether it be a state government or a federal government site in Australia, says, we acknowledge about Aboriginal people. It's
they stamp it on the top right corner of every single letter that they send out on the envelope.
And
as soon as you get the envelope, it's in huge print. Yeah, it's complete lip service.
It's totally meaningless. I mean, maybe some of these people will get like government grants, which is perfectly possible. But for the most part, it's meaningless crap.
Yeah.
And that is what we're in the West at the moment. Is like people who need a bit of help get meaningless crap saying, oh, yeah, you're great.
Yeah, our original credo of negotiation and understanding, that you could make the argument that was the beginning of the fall, but we had no choice because that was our moral sort of preset at the time and still is.
Yeah.
That's why we are where we are. I mean, majority of all of those massacre myths that I was talking about, they all originate from these missionaries that sort of work out in the outback and have little camps set up. And they get told tall tales by the various wandering indigenous people, of upwards of hundreds of people getting killed over here. We saw it by a white man. And a lot of the time it's all second and third hand sort of anecdotes with no evidence whatsoever. And the missionaries just write to the local governments and say, this is what's happened. You need to send out a commission and you need to investigate this. and that's basically the start of all of them. So it's these Christian missionaries who have this white man's savior kind of complex in these areas that a lot of this stuff comes from.
Chris, I lived in South Africa for 15 years under the old white government before Mandela, who was actually the author of the bombing campaign that he admitted. But, forget, Mandela is great these days, but he was actually the bloke who organized a bombing campaign that mainly killed black people, by the way. But there you go. But I lived in South Africa for 15 years, and the same thing happened there. It was the missionaries who turned around and said, "Oh, these bad white dudes are doing this because we've been told this."
Yeah.
But it was mostly lies.
Yeah.
For the majority of people, they got on all right. Sometimes the Africans went and worked for the white guys. Sometimes they didn't.
Yep.
And both were okay. Like sometimes the white guys in the Transvaal, for example, which was an Afrikaner state, brought in hut tax. So the Africans had to go and work for the white guys to make enough money to pay the hut tax. For the most part, that didn't happen in British territories.
Yeah. Can you give me 1 minute, mate? Can you just give me 1 second, buddy? I'll be back. 1 second.
No worries. Anyway, this was a stream we've been looking at for ages. We might do a part 2 at some point where we'll look at more modern stuff, although I'm dubious about doing that because I reckon I'll get banned if I do. And we might compare like Australian relations to the indigenous population with Canadians and Americans and New Zealanders and South Africans. Out of all those people, had anyone wanted to wipe out the Aborigines, it wouldn't have been that hard because the Aborigines were in relatively small tribes that had no technology whatsoever. And if the Brits had really wanted to wipe out the Aborigines, it wouldn't have been difficult to do.
Yeah.
Strange to say, there's plenty of Aboriginals around to this day because the Brits never wanted to wipe them out.
Yeah, and in the periods of time where they claimed that they did do these deliberate sort of aggressive genocidal practices by taking their kids and supposedly trying to breed them out. When you actually look at the statistics of that time of birth rates and population growth and stuff in those areas, in every instance, the population increased in those areas in the indigenous population. So it's like they did a pretty bad job of genociding them. Yeah, exactly. They protected them for the most part. Oh yeah.
And like I said, go and watch shitty movies, really shitty movies like Rabbit Proof Fence. Then go and look at the real story of Rabbit Proof Fence, which like the whole movie is like basically a lie.
Yep.
It's just a bloody lie.
Yep.
But it looks good when you want to say, to all these lefties, these poor darkies were hurt by white Australian people. No, they weren't.
Yeah.
Go and look it up. Anyway, yeah. Chris, anything else you wanted to add? I'm happy to do a part 2 of this if someone else wants to come on, or if you want to do a part 2. But whatever.
I'll have a bit of a chat with some people. I've basically said what I wanted to say on the matter. I'm happy to talk about it a little bit further next time, but it'd be good to get someone else in to bring something to the table and we can chew on it.
John, we'll do a few like what people are saying in the chat if you like, mate. And John, not his real name, says, why is the common idea of officers really negative? I understand many like Spanish in the late 19th early 20th century, and South Vietnamese officers would steal money, etc. I don't know, mate, because like that was never British officers. Like if you did anything even remotely like that as a British officer in the late 18th or 19th century, you wouldn't keep your job very long. You'd be sacked. You ultra quick. You'd be sacked. So yeah, but we still see many non-Anglo-Celtic people turning around and saying things like eternal Anglos. Well, yeah, all right. I don't have much time for eternal Anglos types, to be honest, because Anglo-Celtic people to me are best people in the world and the most civilized. But that's just me. And like I give a shit what Europeans think. Exactly. But yeah. So yeah, I don't know what to say about that. If anyone's got any other questions, ask them quick because we're gonna stop in 10 minutes or so, I guess.
Yep.
Take provisions from the units, inflating numbers to steal more money, but you knew what they were doing and were competent, often lying. John, the real name, I don't understand what you're doing here. Actually, I do. What you're doing is confusing colonels of units, mostly in the 17th century, with like British officers of the 19th century, who are far more heavily controlled than what you're believing there, mate. Chris, I mean, if you have a different opinion, do so.
I don't know anything about those two separate narratives of the British military. Unfortunately, I'm not a military buff, so
yeah, that's my deal. Like way more about the history of Australia than I do.
I can only go by heuristics developed by what we've experienced personally and read about the British credo, and that just seems to be universal across the board in terms of how they conducted themselves. It was very different. I mean, yes, of course, like every fucking system, there are corrupt actors every time. Yes, true. And they're the ones that are usually hyper-focused on to spin a narrative about the overall moral quality of the people in question, which is why they're able to basically propagate this narrative about our project here in Australia as being genocidal, because they'll nitpick particular stories that were actually fabricated, and then they just spray that, even though the exact opposite is true in terms of how we approached people and how we behaved. And you'll see that in the records, and we also embody it now. We still have this same problem of we have this overextended empathy towards others that are less fortunate than us. It's almost pathological to a point, which is why leftism is so fucking rife in the West, is because it facilitates it, because we're a patient, accommodating, and tolerant group of people, and we always have been, or at least in the past few centuries, you know what I mean? Like, that's just been the basis for all our behavior and conducting stuff.
Well said, Chris, well said. I mean, like, if you're a Black American guy, like Kanye West, for example, whose father was a black nationalist, you can want to kill everyone else, and you'll get far less pushback if you're not a straight white male. If you're a straight white male, look out, mate, because you're the supposedly most evil man in the entire history of creation, which of course is a lie. But there we go.
All right.
Yeah. What we got? I would be in the trenches. Look, my great grandparents were indeed in the trenches, and one of my great granddads lost a leg at Passchendaele, 3rd Ypres, and he had a tin leg that my dad used to put marbles in, so that when he walked, it made a sound. But he was a nice, lovely guy. He was a British dude, so And he was quite happy he only lost his leg and not his life. So there we go. All right. I think we've probably done as much as we can do here. Chris, do you have a tune to play us out?
I do indeed.
Cider song.
Can you see there, Cider song? Now, this was a song. Hang on, I'll pause it. This was a song based on a Chesterton poem, which is literally just called A Cider Song. And this is my musical rendition of that poem as commissioned by a certain Mr. Panama Hat many months ago. This project has been put on hold for the moment just because I'm recovering and trying to get my shit together. And then once I'm back into the flow, I'll be able to reopen the sessions and start making music again. So this is a cider song, and it's one of my favorites. I feel weird sort of sitting around watching my own music videos, but I suppose you want to play it, so let's play it.
Drink in paradise and making hot the rain. God brought it burning from the thought to be a sign and signal for that they that drink the blood of God shall never thirst again. The wine they drink in paradise and making hot the rain. Oh yes, they that drink the blood of God shall never thirst again. Why they praise in paradise and make him Ponterey, the purple wine of paradise, but we are better at the price. It's wine they praise in paradise, it's cider that they pray. The wine they praise in paradise, they make him Ponterey. It's the wine they praise in paradise, it's cider that they pray. The wine they want in paradise, they find in Potter's End. The apple wine of Hereford, of Halford Hill and Terford, where woods went down to Hereford, and there I had a friend. The wine they want in paradise, they find in Potter's End, where woods went down to Hereford, and there I had a friend. The subbeat of the blessed go in the soft western vales. The road aside takes a chord, the road from heaven to her fore, where the apple wood of Hereford goes all the way to Wales. The subbeat of the blessed go in the soft western vales, where the apple wood of Hereford goes all the way to Wales. The wine they drink in paradise, they make it hot the rain. Oh yes, they drink the blood of God shall never thirst again.
Oh, it's so ridiculous.
I like those at the end of that one.
With the doggos.
I think they're your two dogs, aren't they?
They are.
I like your two dogs
oafs.
because they can. Yeah, and they're assuming there's something wrong with you because you're lying on the ground. They're coming to help because that's
they
what
always
do. Dogs are good. Yeah, dogs are
Indeed.
good. I like all dogs and a fair number of humans. But there we go. Chris, thank you very much. We'll do a part 2 of this if people want us to, where maybe we'll look at some of the more modern stuff. I don't know. I think we'll have to be more careful with that because
we have to be really careful. YouTube
is not a free speech platform.
Yeah.
At all.
And I was trying to temper myself a fair bit when I was ranting angrily, because as I said, like living here and seeing it in person, it's like, this is not a joking matter. This is really horrible. And I hate when people downplay it.
Well, look, I will say to you, Chris, like when I first moved to Australia in 2000, my love of my life, who was a New South Wales girl, called Samantha, a lovely lady. And like she was your typical Central Coast liberal, if you want to look at it that way, but liberal with a small L. And as we did our great big outback, we spent 6 months going like through the outback and then across the top end. And we ended up on Thursday Island, which is like, extreme far north Queensland, basically. But totally different people. The Aboriginals are not the people who run Thursday Island. That's the Torres Strait Islanders.
Yeah,
different group.
It might be worth having a bit of a chat about the Papua New Guineans and the Torres Strait Islanders that sort of live on the northern part of Australia as well, and the difference. Sort of there.
There is a big difference. The Torres Strait Islanders were big time warriors, and they were headhunters, and like you didn't fuck with them basically if you had any sense. But I mean, like, not unless there was enough of you. But anyway, my Australian love of my life, basically, a girl who I miss to this very day, even though she's been dead for 19 years now. Every single day I miss her. And she was a quite liberal Central Coast Australian lady. But as we traveled through the outback and across the top end, and she met more and more Aboriginal people, she kind of changed her opinion as she actually met these people.
Yep, my mother went through the exact same thing.
Became a bit less liberal, if you know what I mean.
Yeah,
because she actually saw what was going on.
Yeah, and as we know, the liberal sort of presuppositions about people is an abstract concept and usually based on not reality. So they generally come very quick to terms with reality once they encounter it, and their views change.
They think everyone is a black they think everyone is a blank slate, Chris.
Yeah, exactly.
And it doesn't matter where you come from or whatever your background is, you will become this wonderful, kind and liberal person. And this is what my Australian lady used to think when she didn't know any of them. But as we went through little Aboriginal communities, like in the outback and also across the top end, she gradually came to realize that being a little girl, for example, in one of these communities was not a good place to be.
William Turner is correct there. Revealed preferences. Very true. It's exactly what it is.
It is. Anyway, guys, hopefully this will at least start you doing some reading. Like we said, go and read The Fatal Shore. And what was one of the main books you used there, Chris?
I was going through Fabrications of Aboriginal History. I think the book is called, by Keith Windshuttle. That was back in 2000. Yeah. And he was basically writing essays that were summarizing the book. And the book is impossible to obtain. Let's just put it that way. I had a look around on the internet. The only copy I could find of it was one that was in America, and it cost $800. And it didn't even ship to Australia, so you will not find this book unless you can somehow find it in online archives, like scanned prints of it. But this book got fucking disappeared by the libraries and the government and whatnot. Like they disappeared in big time. So
yeah, absolutely. I would say check out Robert Hughes, The Fatal Shore. which for most ordinary average people will give you like the true story of the founding of Australia, and it's not the one that you're taught these days at school, guys. It ain't. It was a hard life to be a settler on the Australian frontier. Most of them did not spend their time killing Aboriginals. Most of them spent their time trying to make a fucking living. You know, and often had Aboriginals who worked for them. Often had. So yeah, it's not what you're told at school these days. It's basically a lie. But anyway, Chris, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Like basically, no, man, this was basically your stream. But yeah, we'll do a part 2 if we get enough people who want us to. So yeah, and Lady Ashore is correct. The fatal short is excellent. And Hughes, who was, I believe, like an Australian art historian, wasn't he, Chris? I think.
Yes.
I'm pretty sure he was he was like an Australian artist and art historian. So yeah, you would have thought he would have been lefty, but actually he wasn't. So there we go. All right, guys, thank you very much for joining us. We'll see you on Saturday for Splendid Isolation number 100, which will be a special stream that I hope we get a lot of people for. And next week, after that, I'm really hoping to do an Aussie stream about modern day politics and the recent re-election of dictator Dan Andrews of the Labour Party, which like really pissed me off the other day. So maybe we'll do a stream on that. And I'd like to get the Franklin on that one. Because he's a great guy. So anyway, we'll go for it. Go well, folks, and thank you for joining us.
Fare thee well.